everybody to Let's Do Lunch. Today is Wednesday, so we will be covering the business of games. We have a great show for you today. But first, let me just say thanks to everybody who showed up yesterday. Wow, that was an unprecedented audience and really engaged audience as we talked about NFTs. And as I said at the end of yesterday's show, we're going to bring Seth and Phil back and pair them with Brian Korn, who's my partner at Manat and is our expert on fintech, blockchain, NFTs, cryptocurrency, etc., for next Tuesday's show, so we can answer a lot of those questions that came out of the meeting related to legal and regulatory issues. So look forward to that next Tuesday. As I said, today we will be covering the business of games, but before I introduce my guests, a reminder that we'd like to hear from you. So please introduce yourselves in the chat. It's right on the bottom nav. You're welcome to drop links in, say a little bit about what you're working on. It's a great place to meet people. I mean, yesterday, God, I must have picked up 30 LinkedIn connections just from yesterday's event alone, as I'm sure other people did. What a great crowd we get every day for this show. And if you have questions for the panel, please put them in the Q&A area just to the left of the chat, also on the bottom nav, so that it's easy for our moderator to pick up those questions. Okay, without further ado, let me introduce Terry Lee, head of 360 and GM of Crunchyroll Games. Welcome, Terry.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Great to be here.
Back on the show. I think you were in season 1 as well. So
that's right.
And with Terry today is none other than David Bloom.
Hey, everybody.
Tubefilter, Forbes, other publications. David, great to have you here.
Always a pleasure to be back here among the fine folks at the Do Crew, as I like to call you guys. And welcome. Terry, delightful to have you on here to talk. It's a particularly interesting day. Another little game company, Roblox, went public today in a somewhat unusual direct offer, basically letting the shareholders who've kept it afloat for a long time as it's built up to cash in, and it looks like they're cashing in big. I think the stock opened with a nominal $45, we think that might be a good price kind of thing, and it shot up to 70 some odd dollars. So
73, yeah.
So someone's doing okay, and God bless them. But that I think speaks to some of the energy and interest in games of many kinds, and particularly mobile. Roblox, I recall, has something like 2/3 of their games go on mobile. You have been all about mobile. So let's talk real quickly, right. I guess to start, let's just sketch out. I think Crunchyroll, I think anime, fantastic, all great. But you are the guy who does everything else. So tell us a little bit about what being the 360 dude, that's a music term that has migrated to games. Tell us real quickly what your role is for them.
Sure. As you noted, anime is kind of closely associated with Crunchyroll's core. And most people think of Crunchyroll as anime. I think for us, we generally see it as more of an ecosystem than just the video streaming side. 360 to us is really the holistic experience outside of video. So that for us includes, of course, games, because there's a huge overlap on the audience, but also events, commerce, manga, and even to a degree, products. So for us, it's about taking, really popular IPs, taking really popular shows, and figuring out all the other ways that we could potentially leverage the underlying narrative, the IP, to provide more ways to engage with our fans. So that's in a nutshell what 360 is for Crunchyroll.
I think it's important. I mean, anime started in Japan, but it is by no means a Japan-only phenomenon anymore. Just the mere existence of Crunchyroll and your soon-to-be corporate cousins, Funimation, and other companies. I mean, I guess the first thing we should mention to folks is Warner Brothers still owns you, part of AT&T. But right. AT&T has a little bit of debt, something like $150 billion, which is more than I make in a week. And they are selling you guys for something, was it 1.75 billion, I think, to Sony? Is that correct?
I think the latest numbers were around 1.2.
1.2. Okay.
Yeah.
But still, that's a lot of streaming over there, and so that, I mean, clearly you guys have some significant value. More generally, to give some picture of the broader anime market, I think last summer I talked, I believe, for another Let's Do Lunch with your general manager Joanne Wag. And she said that the anime space is around 20 billion worldwide, and that's a big number. That's just for perspective, back in 2019, when we still had a theatrical movie industry, those long ago days of the before times, the U.S. film business, domestic film business, grossed about 11 billion and change. So 20 billion for anime, which was supposed to be the cheap, fast and dirty animation that came out of Japan in the post-war era, and now is blossomed into this huge, complex, multiple subgenre universe. Has really taken off. So, but let's talk about the game space. So games are huge, but games based on anime. Talk about that. What is that opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the anime space itself is quite big. Globally, the Western markets, primarily the US leading that market, is one of the fastest growing segments along with China and Korea. So it's definitely no longer a Japan only thing. Now, within the anime game space, what's interesting is that there's actually quite a few animes or games based on anime, but most of them don't really make it out to the West, partially due to the fact that a lot of these games require enough IP recognition to do well, to garner the audience, partially because the game design and construct is a little bit different in the East versus West, and partially because of publishing capabilities.
Now,
so
I know that mobile gaming in general is really hot in East Asia, Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
But that's interesting though, that the games, I mean, I get the brands aren't as well known. They haven't traveled well over here, so it just doesn't make sense to put it up there. And there's a huge market there. But what's actually, from a game construction standpoint, different?
Well, there's a few elements, right? A lot of the anime games tend to be very narrative focused, right? And so in terms of even if you don't recognize the IP, or if you do, like, you have to have enough background on the narrative and the storyline to enjoy the game. If the game is a what if scenario or an add-on of the underlying anime IP and you haven't watched it or you haven't consumed it, even if you recognize the name, you won't get the same enjoyment out of the storyline, right?
You don't know the inside jokes, basically, or the inside,
or the characters, or the significance of the relationships. The second aspect that is pretty acute that we've seen is the core loop is a little bit different in the East, right? A lot of the games that are built is structured in a way that has a very integrated gacha system, which is not as widely received or as popularly received in the West. And in fact, the gacha mechanic in of itself adjusted if you're going to be publishing in Europe due to a lot of the monetization regulations there. And then there's a general notion of what it means for a game to be pay to win or free to play. And that delineation is different if you're looking at a game that's being published in Japan and China versus the West. In our case, a lot of the games that were initially brought over without any sort of adjustments often saw a lot of the fans in the West remark that the games were a little bit too heavy on the pay to win side, a little bit too difficult for free to play players to really accelerate at. So that's a consideration we have to have when we're looking at these opportunities, to make sure that not only is the IP attractive, but the underlying game loop is fair and balanced enough for the Western market.
Yeah, so there's a lot of sort of somewhat surprising opportunities, challenges, though, I think, to translate it. Stuff does get lost in translation. That's important to remember. So when you create games, are you creating them for specific markets then? How many games are kind of limited? Maybe they're Asia focused because you've got an opportunity there. And how many we're just creating for this US market where Crunchyroll got its start?
Yeah, I mean, we'll have a dual pronged strategy right now. The first is really looking at what games are actually popular in Asia that haven't really made it to the West. We know that they have the core loop in the game design well put together, right? And so high engagement, high retention, really strong MAU, DAUs, and we just think that there hasn't been enough of an opportunity to bring those games to the West. So we come in as a publisher, help port the game over and distribute it in the West. So that's really the first pillar. The second pillar is looking at more original developments or original project with studios based off of IPs that we think would work well, adapted into games, or potentially even original IPs that are reminiscent of the overall anime genre. And then we work with some of these smaller studios to build a game from scratch and push them out to the West. So it's a bifurcated strategy.
Okay. Now, in Japan, anime and manga come out together. It's not uncommon for a manga to be based on anime and vice versa. That's within a cinematic universe. Marvel and Disney might think this looks pretty familiar, right? But how often is that sort of 1-2 punch part of your all's, since you're Mr. 360? I think that's going to be your new title, by the way, Mr. 360. It's really encompassing, right? How often are you doing that with the stuff you bring? I mean, like, first of all, how many shows? You guys bring a lot of stuff over from Japan, create some of your own originals. How often are you doing the 1-2 punch? And then 3 to games. So,
yeah, I mean that's a great question. On the manga and anime side, honestly, not as much because most of the titles we license, the anime does come quite a bit after the manga itself, or at least from a seasonal perspective, right? The manga might still be running, but the anime may be based off of the first season of manga. So generally speaking, that gives us enough data to see how the manga performed and how it'll kind of inform the anime performance. So we focus much more on the anime side because we're primarily a streaming platform. So if we think that's strong, the manga rights, if they come with it, is an added bonus, but we don't actively try to make sure that we have both date and date at the same season. On the game side, that's actually quite difficult, mostly because most of the games, because of the high level of investment that requires, most developers actually want to feel confident that the anime itself will perform before they invest a lot of capital in building the game. And then, of course, you add on the typical time it takes to turn around a game. Even a relatively rapid development of an anime mobile game still takes a couple of years. And so, generally speaking, almost all of these games will come out after at least the initial anime has been broadcast. Now, oftentimes what we try to do and what Japan publishers try to do is time that launch of the game with potentially a second season or a third season. And that's also
right. So they get more of a bounce from marketing and all that.
They get these peaks, right? And then they also use that as a gauge to help assess the longevity of that game, because a game these days is not just something that they're going to put out and set it and forget it. There's ongoing live operations, there's ongoing investment and continuity, and they want to feel confident that, like, if I'm going to put in 2 years of development time and multiple years publishing, that there's going to be additional content on the anime side that's going to come in to help revitalize the user base. So that's not a single season anime after which I no longer have much to work with. So
it's really important that, I think what you're saying is it's really important to see these things in a holistic way, again, a very 360 way, where they feed off of each other, where you've got to see the game launch and the way it works feeding into the narrative universe of what you hope is an ongoing anime series or cinematic universe, the equivalent of the Marvel cinematic universe, working there. And that's really crucial. But you touched on something that I think is a really interesting trend over the last few years in mobile, is this notion of it's not a publish it and forget it model anymore. The opportunity is to treat the game as a living thing, and you feed it with more content, more opportunities, more narrative through lines, and a social component. That's the thing I hear a lot from some of the big companies that I've done interviews with. Is that your all's approach, where you're all creating something in a anime focused property?
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely the goal and aspiration for us as well. And that's why it becomes pretty crucially important that whatever IP we go after, we do a lot of assessment around, the potential addition of content after the game launches, right? And what that content is based off of. Within the anime sphere, there's an added level of complexity whereby there are aspects of the game that you want to add the content to, but you have to be very careful that it balances out with the actual narrative side of the anime, because you don't want something to be added to the game that could potentially impact the canon of the storyline or the canon
Right.
of the character.
This is the classic challenge, right? With any spinoff, and some of these things have a very deep canon, a very deep Bible that says that so-and-so only does this and so-and-so is from here, and you can't screw that up because the fans will come and hunt you down, right?
Exactly. And that creates a whole new set of challenges. So a lot of times, when we're trying to figure out, hey, is this anime going to get a second and third season? It's not just for us to understand, how long of a live ops cycle the game has, but it's also for us to understand, like, hey, are there going to be any major plot line changes that we have to be aware of, so that we don't like shoot ourselves in the foot by making one character too important or not important enough?
When he gets shot somewhere other than the foot, is what you're saying. Right. Totally got that.
It could be literal.
Yeah, now he's dead. He doesn't just have a leg.
We made this we made it the most powerful character in the game, but now the narrative completely changed, He's
powerful yet dead, which just takes all the fun out. So what is the sort of typical lifespan then for these things? I mean, your oldest games are a few years old now, if I recall.
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, the anime game life cycle is actually pretty short, right? Save for a few of the tentpole titles that everybody sees. Most of these games come out and they generally have, anywhere between a 12 to 24 month life cycle. Part of that reason is because there is a lot of caution around how much content you can actually put in because the anime is still going. And part of that is because a lot of these games are formulaic. And so if you look at the overall spread of games, a few studios focus on games that have a longer, like 3 to 5 year life cycle, but most studios, they just take a game, they take a formulaic approach and they slap out a game that they can keep running for a couple of years. And then once the users decide to move on to a different IP, they also jump that game to a different IP as well.
Interesting. So I real quickly, I want to tell everybody, please make sure put questions in the Q&A area and I'll pull them up. Second of all, we can't be together quite yet. We can, however, mimic one tiny corner of the IRL experience by putting your LinkedIn connection in there into the chat area and saying what you're looking for, who you are, how to connect with you, like we'd be doing if we were standing in the hallway before or after a conference. So please take advantage of that opportunity to socialize as much as socializing is done on Zoom, Zoomalizing, which I don't recommend to anybody after a year of this stuff. But that being said, and please throw it in there and let's all connect up so that someday we'll have people to go have drinks with again. And in the meantime, you mentioned the short lifespan, which probably suggests the answer to my next question is no. But, just last week, Zynga went out and bought a game studio whose name I can't pronounce, Extra, ECHTRA. Extra, I can't even say it, so it hurts me to say it. There's too many there's too many consonants in a row. It's almost like it's made from Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic. But they were buying it because they have cross-platform experience, and they're taking their mobile games, which is where they made their name, and on Facebook, obviously, and trying to get them onto more platforms, get them onto consoles, because the mobile experience is now, the mobile devices are powerful enough that it makes sense. You can do this stuff. So just curious, is cross-platform something that makes sense in the long term for you, or is it all kind of much more quick hit? We're going to stick with mobile because that's what we know and that's what's a safe investment.
I think cross-platform is definitely rising. It's definitely something we want to explore. But to your point, like given the significance of that investment, porting the game to multiple platforms and supporting multiple platforms, and how different marketing acquisition, user acquisition is on mobile, say versus console and PC, it's going to be a case-by-case basis based on how big the IP in the game is, right? So there are legitimately games that in the anime space that you can easily forecast a 5-6 year roadmap with enough content, with enough longevity that it warrants investing into this multi-platform approach. But then again, there are, a lot of the other games that we've seen coming out to the West, they're intentionally designed to be a fast, rapid consumption, enjoyment, and a move on kind of typical life cycle. So then a multi-platform approach is much more difficult because you're never really going to be able to synchronously launch all the platforms together or all the games on all the platforms together.
Right. It's hard enough to get the darn thing out in some sort of synchrony with the actual stream show. My recollection from talking to Joanne last summer is that you all have a surprising number of tiers of service but it makes sense when you understand that core of otaku superfan who just wants to consume as much of the things they care about as they possibly can. And ultimately your job, not just the company as a whole, but particularly your job, is to just shovel that stuff in there, and obviously at a high level way, but you're trying to feed the beast at a very intense level, right? So, I mean, how many tiers do you guys have? Like 4 or 5 or something like that? I can't remember.
Well, I think we'll definitely try to simplify it because there has been a point where our users have told us, hey, this gets really complicated and confusing. Right? So
you're right.
I think we're trying to create essentially like three user journeys, right? One is if people who basically don't ever really are not going to be the paying type. So there's an ad-driven experience. And then the second is people who are primarily focused on the anime piece. So there's a paid subscription experience for the streaming side.
And you've got like 3 million of those paid streaming subs, right? Something like that.
Yeah, a little bit higher than that now. I think we're closer to the 4 now. So we've been growing really fast. And then the third part we're looking at is creating segments for people who want to experience the holistic narrative. So, in addition to streaming, maybe we'll add in some aspects of commerce. Maybe we'll add in some aspects of consumer products. And now we are actively exploring how to better integrate our games with our subscriptions, so that maybe if there's in the future, there's an all-encompassing pass for Crunchyroll where you get tokens for various games to play in addition to access to the streaming site. So that's something we're actively exploring to figure out how to provide a more kind of fulfilling experience to the fans.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, so what does that look like? So is that just I don't know, the anime sword, the giant sword that they can, like the fake sword that would have been in the game / movie? Is it I don't know, the mecha robot kit? I mean, what is that? What kind of stuff are you selling or providing to the super fan?
Well, right now on the commerce side, what we have is we do periodic capsules that are based off of an IP, and what that basically means is we create specialized merchandise. It could be anything from apparel to figurines to everyday goods.
It's a capsule and not a box, because that's different, right? So somehow a box is completely a different container than a capsule.
Well, we call it a capsule, but it's a virtual capsule. It doesn't physically come. It just means a collection. Okay. That's a limited time collection. But yeah, so a lot of our commerce experience is just based off of products that are built around the most popular IPs and the shows that we have on the service. And it changes every season because the shows change every season.
Right. Do you have then exclusives? But are there exclusives though that are for the super fan, and then others that are like whoever shows up can buy this if they want to buy it? I mean, is there stuff that only goes to the super fans? So they only have access to some stuff? Is there tiers of access for even the gear?
At this point, no. And that a lot of that is because we don't necessarily want to restrict the ability to have access to various merchandise. I think what it is more around the fact that for the higher tiers, we would look at ways to help provide discounts to the stores, or provide discounts to the commerce site for people who we know will want to purchase multiple products at a time. And so using that as an incentive instead of gating specific products, just because we think that will lead to a more detrimental experience for most of the users who want to watch.
And you'll make less money.
Maybe. We haven't, the reality is we actually haven't had enough time to really explore the commerce side. The commerce piece of it, while it's been around for a couple of years, is still relatively new relative to like the long history we've had on the streaming side.
Sure. So and you've had this pandemic, which has sort of complicated commerce in general, right? So you've had to.
The pandemic has been interesting. I mean, like we actually haven't seen a very big slowdown on our commerce and our streaming side. I guess people when they're stuck indoors, they
They're
want to watch
buying.
shows and they want to buy stuff. Yeah.
But the problem is you want to buy this thing that you want to use in your cosplay at Comic-Con, and it's all virtual. So it's like, what's the point?
Well, we are
So,
doing virtual cosplay or
Well,
costume competitions.
talk about that, because the whole, I mean, Fortnite obviously was hugely successful, and a whole bunch of other folks are in the same space with free game, with lots of digital add-ons that you pay for, and that's where the billion-dollar baby is for Fortnite. How does that play out with what you guys do?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit different for us because most of our games are built around a pre-existing IP, right? So to the extent to which we can create a lot of freedom on different character designs and different character costumes are going to be limited. But we try to do it in other ways of 360, right? We just had, for example, we had our Crunchyroll Expo late last year, and it was a virtual.
You should call that your Crunchpo.
Crunchpo. Well, I see our
Crunchpo. That
has
sounds
nice
much more
Expo.
catchy. Yeah, the Crunchpo. Let's go to the Crunchpo.
Then,
so you had a virtual Crunchyroll Expo, and you
Yep.
had virtual cosplay that you all
we had
were
a virtual
providing.
cosplay contest, and so people will basically just just stream from their homes, and then we will have a panel of virtual judges and go through. And it was actually a very good event. People were very, very into it. People told us they were really looking forward to being able to put all their hard work of costume making into use.
Sure. Finally, right? I mean, it's like, we could do this again. Oh my God. Yeah, right. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there was, to an extent, an audience, not the same type of experience as a live show, but we do what we can to at least provide them some avenue to engage with the broader fans.
Right. I bet but are you selling virtual goods that could be, I mean, I'm just thinking about the whole idea of dressing up your avatar there's like a psychological value to that, not just a financial one, of being able to dress up and one of the researchers looked at Fortnite and said, okay, the ability to be your true self, to express yourself,
totally.
Whether it's a fake, a virtual NFL jersey or a Captain Marvel outfit or whatever it is, whatever that thing ends up being, or some weird thing that they've come up with, their artists have come up with, it's valuable, right? So
yeah, 100%. Well, I mean, I think the ability to identify as your avatar or project yourself into the game is 100% valuable. I think we certainly do want to do that. I think it's a little bit harder with anime-derived games that are based off existing IPs. I think if we went the route of creating more original games off original IPs, that's something that we would definitely want to explore. Like the whole concept of a virtual goods, virtual commerce is something we would explore.
Yeah. Berg Marksity, who I've known a long time and would warn everyone away from because he's a dangerous man, he says, I am not super familiar with the gaming space. I find that unbelievable, given how omnipresent games are in the pandemic. But he says, thinking of the fast turnaround with the COVID vaccine, do you see technology contributing to a quicker turnaround in various elements of game development in the near term? Basically, are we figuring out some things to be able to crank these games out quicker? I mean, for things like mobile, never mind the cross-platform. Are we getting the tools to create compelling game experiences that shorten the delivery timeframes for you?
Potentially. I mean, we've definitely seen elements of development tools or evolutions in the game development side that shorten the development time of the game. The main challenge right now is to make sure that those practices that are put in place to accelerate games to market don't necessarily degrade the quality, right? Because what's more common is that a lot of studios decide we're going to take a off-the-shelf cookie cutter approach. So we'll design the
match 3 game, right?
Yeah, right. Of all these genres, just reskin them.
Yeah, right. And that's nothing more exciting than that, right?
Yeah. And then, well, the problem is there's after a while, fans can tell, right? A core gamer can tell this is just a reskin. There's nothing fundamentally different. So that's the sort of the tightrope where we have to walk.
Okay. In terms of Tyler Getz, bless him, a man I do not know, but I appreciate his question. What genres of games work well? I mean, you talked about some of the games that are common in East Asia markets, in particular, the gigantic mobile game market in Asia, don't always translate well to the US. But what does in an anime-focused licensed game? What makes sense in terms of a structure? Are these narrative games? Are these role-playing games? Are they, I mean, what are the genres that make sense?
Yeah, so I mean, I've seen anime games adapted into, base building, strategy, fighting, RPG, and idle. Probably the two genres that have done the best are RPG games and idle-based games. Part of that is to the point you made earlier about the ability to stay with the character, to project parts of yourself onto that character as you build that character up over time.
It's a form of cosplay, ultimately. I mean, it's like not only you dressed as them, but now you're playing as them and being within them in an adventure in that universe, right?
You get attached to the characters that are involved because you're sort of helping them grow and level up, right? And I think the other aspect that makes those two genres more successful than the other is the fundamental ability to keep adding on content, right? To a degree to which, if you have a traditional fighting game, you could add potentially additional tournaments, you can add additional fighters, but you're limited to the extent to which you can add a lot of content in terms of character design, character evolution. Whereas for an RPG, you can add more levels, you can increase new equipment, you can add more costumes, you can add more monsters. So the possibilities are much more broad. So that's what we've seen, and that's what we've focused to date on, which is primarily RPG-driven games.
Okay, and I'm going to make a shameless attempt because Seth Shapiro and Phil Ranta had a heavily attended thing yesterday, and I've known those guys. I actually taught a class with Seth at USC on the business of entertainment a few years back, and I've known Phil a long time as well, and they're smart guys talking about non-fungible tokens. But I'm curious because you're Mr. 360. We're in the middle of a rainstorm. If you hear any background noise, I can't do much about it. But I'm curious about the NFT component of collectible stuff, Mr. 360, and how that might play into games, because there's a lot of conversation I'm hearing on places like Clubhouse about that. And in some of the other stuff, the collectible stuff that you guys are spinning out of anime. What is the opportunity here? Is this something you're thinking about in any way? Is there a direction you may be headed with this? And by the way, this should get us a whole bigger audience. I'm looking forward to Ned bringing us back next year or next week to talk about it. So,
I mean, I think that's a very good question. I think we've definitely talked about it, right? Like how that concept can layer into the game economy overall, or economy of all these games.
Right.
Honestly, I don't know that we've really come to a consensus or figured it out on the anime game side. Part of it is because, sort of to the point you made earlier around, like, there has to be enough customization, enough personalization, enough enough of a commerce within that whole exchange to be able to make this sort of token work. And if you're limited into what you can monetize against, if you're basing the game on a very IP-centric and limited kind of scope, there's only so much that you can actually provide to the users through this form of commerce, right? And so, simply as a way of accepting a new form of currency potentially, but in terms of how it can expand upon the current commerceable experience for anime games, I think that remains to be seen. I think that requires a lot more of these games to be based off of original IPs and expanded open worlds, expanded custom player bases than the limited kind of customization that's available today.
Yeah, I think that's a really key question here, because you mentioned a couple of times original IP versus the licensed stuff. When you own it, you can do many more things with it. It's a little bit more of a big swing, right? It's not just saying, hey, we're going to have the hottest new anime series that's just debuted in Japan 4 hours ago, and now we're going to premiere that for our biggest fans now, and everybody else gets to see it, I don't know, 2 weeks from now or whatever, versus we're going to create our own. I know Joanne had said you guys do some original anime series, right?
Yep. A lot of that is based on this notion that we want to make sure that as we're growing and taking anime from Japan to the West, we also want to be cognizant of what Western audiences like and what their tastes are. And there could be some subtle differences. Yeah. And we're experimenting with original anime and original games to see if we can create something that caters more to the Western preference.
Well, now that begs the question of what are those subtle differences? What is different about, I mean, I know we're clueless about wonderful Japanese traditions like the tea ceremony and calligraphy and flower arranging that are sort of lost on the Western tastes, unfortunately, and certainly on a heathen like me, though I do love my tea, particularly my green stuff. But that being said, I mean, what can you quantify in any way the sort of subtle differences in the storytelling, you know, you talked a little bit about the game side, but I'm just sort of curious in general how that manifests.
Well, there's a bunch of different elements, none of which are necessarily like in isolation the crux of a change. But for example, when we look at original development, we would look at the whole dialogue and the overall interaction being structured from the English language perspective instead of a localized foreign language, right? And so that changes sort of the way that a lot of the tones and a lot of the conversations go. Second is we would look at bringing in potentially better known voice actors in the English language world, right? That adds character or flavor to the underlying individuals in the setting.
Right.
And the third would be looking at themes that may be more prominent or more timely within the US or within the Western world that don't often get explored in tradition or in animes that originate in China or Japan. And so those are some elements that we explore. Obviously, being mindful that we want to stay as true as possible to the roots of anime from the art style perspective, right, and from the overall quality of production perspective.
There's both an opportunity and a limitation there between whether it's original or licensed stuff that you kind of got to stay on the farm. Basically, you can't go wandering off to other areas because this audience knows what it likes and it's very clear about it, right?
That's right. And there's sort of an evolving kind of definition of what is true anime.
Right.
You know, if you go back 10 years ago, you look at the core fans, they may have a much more narrow definition of what constitutes authentic anime, whereas now that might have been expanded a little bit more based on the broader user base.
Right. I mean, now there's a global fan base for it that just didn't exist really 10 years ago. I remember Viz Media and Tokyo Pop and some of those early manga and video importers and translators doing their thing, but it really is a much more substantive thing. But I mean, it does almost become who's in the club and who's not. If you get too rambunctious with the style or the subject matter and all that, it's like, you're not ours, and you can't do that, and we hate you. We'll hunt you down. So Darren Phillips suggests, and I think this is actually an interesting, it's sort of what was floating in my little tiny brain. He thinks you could monetize via limited number of digital prints from players' favorite scenes or parts of games. Much like, and I think this is an interesting metaphor, much like having a booth with numbered prints for sale at Comic-Con, but without the sweaty, smelly crowds. That's my editorializing, but without the sweaty, smelly crowds pressing in upon you on every way, making you think you're going to have a pandemic issue even before we had a pandemic issue. That
Especially
being said,
afterwards.
Oh my God, I love Comic-Con, but man, I just can't imagine going back into the convention center for at least 5 more years. I got to tell you. Anyway, so that being said, that's kind of an interesting idea. You know, the addition of, you know, the limited edition art print thing is certainly a huge thing in the art business. The art business is definitely diving into the NFT space in a big way. That might be something. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think generally speaking, that concept of limited quantity perks, limited quantity items, or whether digital or not, is definitely something that we've been exploring the game side. One of the things that we're trying to be mindful of is creating a structure within that doesn't feel like it's a race condition for the players. It's not like somebody who has to crank out a certain milestone or stay up all night. And on the other hand, it has to be something that it doesn't feel like players who basically pay the most money can get to. There has to be some way to like.
You don't have to be just a grind. You don't have to be just a whale to have an enjoyable time.
Exactly.
That's really the balance, right?
And to be able to obtain one of these limited items, there has to be some way that almost everyone can participate to some degree, even if the number of ultimate winners are limited, ultimate prints are limited, for example.
Yeah, there's probably a legal issue there, and I'd certainly leave, much as Seth and Phil did yesterday, leave to the great minds at Manat Phelps, beginning with Ned Sherman, the idea of whether, if, for instance, you had everybody does this, and some people, does X amount of tasks within the game, and some group of them, not all of them, but some group of them gets access to a limited edition print. Right, that ends up becoming a little lottery. There's skill, but there's some lottery-esque component to it. I mean, there was a Kotaku piece last week that said a lot of what's going on out there feels a lot like a loot box, and that was a very interesting metaphor, because it's like the loot boxes are having a lot of regulatory challenges, and this isn't quite that, but it's like you get a pack of the hot shots, the NBA thing that they're doing with Dapper Labs, where you got the really high value thing you might get, but in there's a bunch of sort of everyday dunks that no one cares about or whatever, right? So it's a little bit more like a trading card game, but it's problematic with some authorities in some countries. So what's your thought about that?
Yeah, I mean, you said it right on the point. I think a lot of the way you design a lot of these kind of drop mechanics or item mechanics, you have to consider the fact that, is there a way for the average player to obtain this, even if it means a lot of time put in and a lot of effort put in, versus is it only possible to obtain through essentially a repurposed gambling mechanic? If it's the latter, then it's going to be, first of all, you're probably not going to be able to do it in parts of the Western countries. Like EU has a pretty harsh stance on
right.
Pure gachas.
Loot boxes are bigger in Asia, right? I mean, the Asian
for sure,
game
almost
culture,
every game has loot boxes
all over the place, right?
Right,
yeah.
Almost every game, right? But once you start bringing that over here, you have to start adding in layers where, yes, loot boxes could be a way for you to accelerate your path to obtain an item, but there should be other ways to achieve that kind of item or character or costume, even if it takes a long time. If you only put it into a loot box and it only feels like a random drop rate every time, then it starts to look closer and closer to gambling, and that has a negative connotation with the player base here.
Okay, and so you can't go there. Alyssa Klein, who I'm going to guess is a musician who is into pop/classic rock, Americana style music. I'm just guessing, given the nature of the question. Asks, hello, any games that might use pop rock, classic rock, Americana style music? I mean, I'm sort of curious about, just as we talked about certain visual styles and certain genres that are considered okay in this space, that meet the expectations of the audience, this very specific yet large audience. Is there a music expectation too? Says it, no, it has to sound like 8-bit Nintendo games, or I mean, like, how does that
work? No, first of all, I think music is a huge component of the enjoyability of a game, right? And right. The ability for someone to immerse themselves. So absolutely, I think it's critical to have high quality music and soundtracks in. I think in terms of the genre of the music, it basically comes down to what is the genre of the game or the IP, right? So as an example, a lot of anime games that get made are of the fantasy genre, right? And so as an immersive experience, you want high quality music in, but they probably pick fantastical elements of musical or orchestral pieces in. Whereas if you had other genres of music, it just takes the player out of that experience if they're looking at a medieval fantasy game. So I think it just comes down much more to the IP and to the game than it does what the convention of music is. I think we're moving away from fixed conventions of music in games and more into, does this music just connote the right experience and overall immersiveness that the game wants to present?
Yeah. So we are about out of time. Michael, I'm going to butcher his last name because I don't speak Mandarin very well. Michael Zhuang, I think, asks, what do you think about the general quality of anime IP-based game development today versus 5-10 years ago? And what I'd like to do is contrast where we've been with where you think things are going, because that'll be a nice way to wrap up this thing. Terry, real quickly, give me a sense of where we've been, where we are, where we're going.
Sure. I mean, I think quality is definitely going up, but the noise is also going up. So where we've been is, historically, anime games were far and few between relative to all the other genres of the games, right? And that's largely because traditionally it was defined as a very fixed set of IPs that turned into games that were published by a very small group of elite publishers.
It was a real club, basically.
It really was, right? And today, I think the definition of what constitutes an anime game and what gets accepted by fans as an anime-esque game has grown tremendously, and that's allowed more Japanese publishers, but also a lot of Korean and Chinese and even Western publishers to get in on that club, right? And so, by definition, when you expand the pipe, you're going to see more quality games come through. But at the same time, I think what we are in danger of going down towards is basically there's a lot of copycats. There's a lot of noise. There's a lot of studios that come in and want to ride a wave and basically slap together some cutesy art, but ultimately don't really give strong consideration to the game and to the core mechanics. And so, yes, on an absolute scale, quality is going up, but in a proportion of number of options people have, I don't think it'll be a higher proportion of quality games. Yeah, I think it'll actually take more effort to find that jewel, especially if you look on the Apple Store now. Like, you'll see a ton of games that feel like they're reminiscent of anime, but vast majority of them you're not going to play, or you're not going to enjoy playing. So I think it becomes more and more important to find and identify the right publishers that are focusing on quality instead of quantity.
As always, curation is vital in an era of endless choice. So, Terry, real quickly, thank you so much for hopping on. How can people find you? How can they connect with you? Do you want to connect with them?
Yeah, just find me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty easy to find. I hope there's not too many Terry Lees, but Terry Lee at Crunchyroll. I can also drop my LinkedIn into the chat.
Drop it in the chat. You can find me, David Bloom, on Twitter at David Bloom, as you can see below, and on LinkedIn at David L. Bloom. And with that, I will turn it back over to the esteemed Ned Sherman to talk about tomorrow's Rights Tech conversation and how everything's going to go NFT in the next 12 hours and go from there.
Thank you, David, and thank
Thanks
you, Terry. Great conversation today. And David, I have to say, you've shown a lot of backgrounds when you've done these shows in the past, and this one was really serene and relaxing. I feel like I almost did meditation over Let's Do Lunch today. So
I'm here for you, sir. That's the Valley Floor in Yosemite Valley, and if it induces a little meditative state, a little Zen moment amid the anime conversation, the animated anime conversation, well, so be it.
Thank you, my friend. All right, for tomorrow's Rights Tech roundtable, the topic will be licensing music for your app. You will not want to miss it. It can be a complicated process, but we're going to break it down and give you some of the tools that are out there that allow it to be a little less painful. And of course, our good friend Paul Sweeting will be leading that conversation tomorrow, noon Pacific. Have a great day, everybody. Bye.